Off top in the 1987 NFL player strike, two of the most famous scabs, Sean Payton and Suge Knight. Play the music.
This is the Domonique Foxworth Show.
All right, welcome to the Domonique Foxworth Show. I'm so happy to be joined by Howard Bryant, author, historian, producer, and author of upcoming book, Kings and Pawns, which I'm looking forward to checking out and adding to my collection of Howard Bryant books. Welcome to the show, sir.
Appreciate you having me, Dominique.
I really wanted to have you on, especially because we're doing this 1987 strike as far as football is concerned. So this offseason has been, for me at least, an offseason of conversations around sports labor. We have which seems to be an impending WNBA strike. We have all the turmoil that's going on in the NFLPA, which I guess turmoil is a nice phrase for what's actually happening over there. The Bryce Harper fighting with Rob Manfred. It just feels like Micah Parsons and Trey Hendrickson demanding trades and kind of petitioning in a way for a little bit more NBA-style player empowerment. And most recently, Roger Goodell made the point that they are no longer in competition with sports leagues. The NFL is in competition with Apple and Google. And it may not feel like it, but that takes me back to the 1987 strike. What do you think, Howard?
No, I think it's true. And I think that to make that statement, for Roger Goodell to make that statement, is essentially to say, look, we don't have sports competition. And they've earned that in some way when you look at the power, the ratings power, the financial power, if you're going to have power, you have to have power over your workforce, the power they have over the players in so many ways, despite the increases that players have in guaranteed contracts, et cetera, and visibility. The NFL is the beast. The NFL is the dominant professional sports league in the country right now. And when they look at where they're going, when they look at who they're competing with, they don't see the NFL, the NBA, and they don't see the NHL, and they don't see Major League Baseball. So, of course, they're setting their sights at the most powerful media institutions in the country.
So obviously I've had a long history of involvement in sports unions, and most specifically the NFLPA, and I have a pretty good understanding, or at least I thought I had a pretty good understanding of the history of the labor in the NFL and how it felt like just a kind of steady upward climb towards the life that we have now as athletes. But looking back at this and talking to you, frankly, off of the Zoom screen, talking to you about the history of this stuff, it's just kind of eye-opening to what was actually happening in '87. It didn't feel like a trajectory upward. The decertification and lawsuit that led to free agency kind of put a bit of something close to a happy ending onto what felt like a bit of a downward spiral for the NFL players versus the league.
Well, there's no question when you go back to '87 for people who do remember that period. It was the low moment for the NFLPA, for the players especially. And 15% of the players crossed the picket line coming out of in the first 2 weeks. The strike only lasted a month. And you don't have any power. If you're not going to be run by your stars, you're going to lose almost immediately. And so think about the players. Even if you weren't there, you know the names. Joe Montana crossed the picket line. Tony Dorsett crossed the picket line. Randy White, Danny White, Mark Gastineau, Mark Wilson, some of the best players in the game at the time, and some Hall of Famers. Mike Webster, Hall of Famer, Pittsburgh Steelers. There's no way that center's going to hold when these guys cross. And in retrospect, when you think about it, the convenient narrative has been, well, the players just got walked over. And they did. But there's a lot of reasons why they got walked over. And when you think about why the game is as powerful as it is now, you have to think about the vulnerabilities that those players were faced with then.
The idea that there were star players who crossed the picket lines, is not surprising necessarily, but the reasons why, I think, were somewhat surprising, because there were players who just didn't care and didn't feel connected to the union. But I know, at least for Tony Dorsett, the way that the story is retold to me is that he was pretty ardent union guy and took some of the ire of the fan base, but eventually it got to the point where he felt like it wasn't worth it anymore because there was no solidarity within the union and there was no chance of victory.
Well, it's a few things. I think it's important to talk about power. And for the history of sports, the players have never really had it. I tell fans, and they don't want to hear this, but I do believe it to be true, that you might not want to know it, but winning does not come first with professional sports owners. If you're lucky, winning is fourth. The first thing that they care about is cost control. That's why salary caps are so important. Can we count on how much this is going to cost every year? The second thing they care about is controlling player movement. Do we have the opportunity to maintain our players? Let's make sure they don't have the opportunity to leave us or to stay, that we can get rid of them when we want to and we can keep them when we want to. The third thing they care about, of course, is gaining concessions from their arena and from municipalities. Let's make sure we own our arena. So when Taylor Swift is playing in our stadium, we get the money. We get the concession money. We have control over where we play, which also, if you're a Raiders fan, you know this, which also gives us the opportunity to move whenever we feel like moving. So, and then after all of that business, now we get to winning. Maybe winning games comes fourth, if you're lucky, if you have an organization that views it that way. And it may not even be fourth, but at best you're going to get is you're not even going to be on the podium when it comes to why these sports teams operate. And so when you think about Tony Dorsett at that time, it was very, very common that player contracts were very complicated when it came to needing money. The owners have the money, the players needed the money. And in Tony Dorsett's case, it wasn't just the fact that they didn't see a pathway to winning. It was the fact that so much of his contract was also tied up to his retirement. It was tied up to his annuities. It was tied into the different loans and things that the team was giving him. And when you take all that away, that strike wasn't just going to cost him in 87, it was going to cost him in 2025 or however long he lived. I mean, think about when we laugh about the Bobby Bonilla thing, about him getting paid every single year, even though he hasn't played in 20 years. These are the things where the players are like, we don't have any leverage. And this is also where that sort of, as you know, as an ex-player and being in the union, where that literacy really does come in.
The idea that winning isn't always the most important thing is a salient one, but it is when it comes to labor disputes. And and looking back at the 87 strike, and the players, is understanding for the context of the time, is like the players had struck in 82, and then they struck again in 87 with a similar plan and strategy. And it seemed that once the war had already been won, or the battle at least had been won by the owners, it wasn't enough just to return to work. They also seemed to want to twist the knife a bit and discourage any future dissent, and to the point where they wouldn't even accept the idea that the players wanted to disallow the record books to have in those stats recorded for the scab weeks, which was abysmal football. Yeah, and does exactly. It's just a change like that is not even connected to the fact that they postponed allowing the players back in order to force them to miss another check. So while we think of these teams as relentless competitors, that competition is a little bit more relentless, it feels like, in punishing when it comes to questioning or challenging their power.
You're crushing the rebellion. You're crushing dissent, 100%. And as the great labor leader Don Fear over at the Major League Baseball Players Association once told me, the game is not Red Sox-Yankees. The game is owners versus players. Don't ever forget that. That's the game. So when you're talking about winning, absolutely. What the owners in 87 weren't just trying to win in 87. They were trying to win in 97 and 2007 and 2027. They were making sure that the players never believed that they could take them on again. And you have to remember, it's really important to remember the time period that we were in back then. You're in the 1980s, the Reagan 80s, which is an incredibly pro-management, supply-side economics, anti-labor time period. But while that is happening, you're also in the middle of massive upheaval in terms of sports free agency. You've got, the NBA is really, really pushing for unrestricted free agency in 1980, 84, 85. You've got baseball, which had been going back and forth. You had the 80 lockout, you had the 81 strike, you had the 85 lockout. You had all kinds of different battles, and that was on top of the 76 lockout and the 72 strike. And so but baseball had really, really been the standard. You can't understand football without understanding what's happening in baseball. And what's happening in baseball coming out of the 1975, the December Peter Seitz decision, which is the landmark sports decision, which is no team can control you for life. It used to be a one-year contracts, and there was no free agency. And once free agency started, now the players finally have power. And if you're a basketball player, you're like, hey, we want some of that. If you're a football player, we want some of that. And the owners in baseball had no intention of giving that up. They simply lost a court case. And so the battle, once the baseball owners lost, the argument was, okay, we'll allow free agency, but we want a player in return. We want compensation. We want money in return. We want a draft pick in return. We want somebody on your roster in return, which is known as free agent compensation. And the owner and the players are like, no, that's not free agency. And if you get compensation back, then teams aren't going to want to sign free agents because they're not going to want to give up pieces of their roster. And that was key in the NFL because that had already been the system in the NFL since 1963. From 1963 to 1976, the NFL had something called the Rozelle Rule, which was, okay, you can leave, but we have to first offer you a contract at 90% of your salary for 1 year, right? And then if a team does choose you the next year, the commissioner gets to step in and take a player off the other roster and give it back to you. And they had been in court. This had been illegal. The NFL had been operating illegally for a decade and a half on this. And so by the time you get to 87, you have this battle once again. What are we talking about? Player control, free agency.
The frame that we're looking at it now, it makes it interesting because I think we look at free agency and we call things free agency now that aren't actually free agency. And the idea that there was a time that we came from where the Rozelle Rule existed. And so it seems like where we are now as far as professional sports is concerned, it's like true, real free agency, which it still really isn't.
Which it's not, though, because let's ask you the question, right? Let's just keep it to football. How many starting in prime quarterbacks ever get to become free agents? Virtually none.
Right. Oh yeah, no, I'm agreeing that it's because of where we come from, and it's because of the context.
But we still call it free agency.
Exactly, and that's one of the an old political trick that works quite often is what you name something often change the way that you appreciate it and you accept it, and also the journey that you've taken. Because I think about the 87 strike as one as a turning point. The reason why we're focusing on that and the idea that there were replacement players and we're focusing on this particular event is because it feels like the future of the league that we live in today, how we feel about it from a player's perspective was defined then. And whatever positivity we have about it is defined in relation to what happened in 87. And whatever negativity we have about how the league exists today and the players exist today is in relationship to what happened then. And I know that firsthand from when I first got involved with the union and Gene Upshaw was still alive. We went to our meetings, which is the most outrageous thing ever. I think I've told you this. We went to my first trip to the meetings. We had breakout sessions for the reps, and the theme of the breakout session was why strikes don't work, which is
not the breakout session you want from a union.
And that's Gene Upshaw. That's the guy we hold out as like the representation of NFL Players Association as like the strongest guy we've ever had. He was leading breakout sessions that were saying that strikes don't work. And they didn't work for us. And that, had it worked, we might be looking at something totally different.
Well, that's right. Well, let's talk about that. When I was covering the Washington football team back in 2005 to 2007, I saw Gene right before he passed. I'm in the parking lot at Redskins Park, and he had just gotten slapped on the wrist, punched in the face, however you want to call it, by Bryant Gumbel on Real Sports on HBO, who essentially called him the NFL's lapdog. And he was hot. And he was enraged about this, and he thought it was insulting, and he thought it was unfair, and he went back, and where did he point to? He pointed to 87. And he was like, in 1987, we were ready. Everybody was ready to go. We were ready to strike. We had set a strike date for September 15th. We were prepared to go all the way. And before I finish the story, you should know that the NFL players, had also already gone to the legendary Marvin Miller in baseball, who had won so many concessions for the baseball players, to represent them. And Marvin was like, I can't represent you because you won't stick together. You guys are the toughest players in the world. You have the most physical jobs in the world in terms of professional sports. Your bodies take the most punishment, but you won't stick together. You don't have what it takes to stick together. And so fast forward to talking with Gene. Gene says, I ran up that hill in 87. And when I looked behind me, there was nobody there. So from that day forward, I decided that what these players really want is money. Within this structure, no more strikes. I'm just going to get you as much money as I can possibly get you. And that changed the entire mindset of the Players Association going forward. And then by the time you get to DeMaurice Smith, you start to fight for a few more things. You start to fight for, Goodell is the law and order commissioner, and you're starting to try to fight for some more, control against discipline and arbitration and all those things. But the die had been cast from 1987.
Yeah, the idea, to me at least, that Marvin Miller would turn down the players in part because he recognized something about them as unwilling or not having the same solidarity to other sports. Like, that's interesting to me because of the point that you were making. Like, the players in football, it is a very interconnected sport. It is a very dependent sport. It's the least individualistic sport of all the sports, major pro-American sports that we watch or care about. And I would think, obviously, that as a football player, there's something intrinsic about it. So they're not different humans. Is there something about the ability to organize or the history of the game or the history of the people that are involved in the game to lead us to a point where even the greatest, sports union leader, I guess Marvin Miller, and outside of sports, just general union leader was like, nah, I can't do nothing with that?
Well, there's two pieces to it. Let's take the first piece, which is the players themselves. Unlike any other sport, you've got a massive, massive, massive division of labor in football. Football is based on division of labor. That's why everyone likes to make all these war analogies and everything else about everyone's got their job. Whereas in basketball, you got 5 guys on the court, and if you've got Michael Jordan can do everybody's job, right? He can do a little help defense, he can score, he can defend, he can pass, he can do everything. The quarterback's not helping you when they're on defense.
Right.
They're also wearing helmets. So the immediate recognition does not resonate to the public the same way it does with the other sports, with baseball, for example. The quarterback is by far the most valuable, most glamorous position on the field. His needs and his rights and his salary is very, very different than the long snapper or the defensive back. So these guys aren't necessarily all playing the same sport in terms of the business. My money is not your money if you're a left tackle. Now, obviously, that money had gone up once the quarterback became more important, but when it was a running back sport, the left tackle wasn't making any money. And now that it's a quarterback sport, what do we say about the running backs? They're dime a dozen now. So there's intrinsically in that sport, you all don't have the same interests. That's the first thing. The second thing, when you're looking at 87, is you have to go back to 82. 82, the players said what they were going to do in terms of striking, and they did it. And they took everybody off guard, and they won some concessions. 87, they told everybody what they were going to do. They were going to follow the 82 playbook, but this time, they calculated that the public does not want to watch bad football. The public does not want to watch B-grade, C-grade football. The public is going to immediately see what was taking place, and they said, okay, they're either going to shut the game down Or even if they try to get replacement players, the public is going to reject replacement players because the public only wants to see world-class football. And the players were wrong. What happened was that the owners decided to keep the games going. They hired replacement players. Life went on. And as life was going on, the players started to realize we don't have any leverage for one really important reason. And that was that the TV networks kept broadcasting the games. And so you're really up against it, which is why I try to say it's not just that the players got waxed. The players were going up against a massive machine. If the broadcast network said, look, we are not going to broadcast replacement player football, the entire dynamic changes from a power perspective. But as long as those TV networks were willing to keep the games going, now some sponsors said, hey, we're not going to support this. Some of the beer sponsors said we're not going to support it. But for the most part, life went on. And as life is going on, Tom, life is going on. Now you're Joe Montana, and you're Joe Montana, and you're Tony Dorsett, and you're like, I got to get back on the field. I got responsibilities. And they just got boat raced.
Obviously, reading these things, I originally get frustrated and angry at the players who cross the picket lines, and then I also take into effect the context of what's going on and looking around and understanding the opportunities and understanding that the motivation cannot only be individual. And
that's right.
That the motivation has to be about a lineage and a legacy and doing it for those who did it for you and doing it for those who come after you. And that is something that's hard to cultivate, especially when we've never really had control of the media levers. NFL Films has done so much for the popularity of the game, but it's also done so much to indoctrinate the way that we think about being a part of the football team or being a part of the NFL. It does not feel in the same way that it should feel, I think, when you think about labor unions. And so while there was support from the broadcast networks and largely the fans didn't stop watching, there were some cities that were labor cities.
That's right. Well, the fans did stop watching. They lost 20%. They lost a ton. Mm-hmm. They lost it. It wasn't like the fans were like, give me high school level football on my Sundays. They didn't. They really did shut down a lot. But what they didn't do, where do you blame the players? When you sit back down and you say, okay, how do we win? That's the big thing. If we're going to do this, how do we win? Now, politically, psychologically, there were people who just weren't labor people, like Joe Montana.
Right.
Just not a labor guy. Howie Long crossed the picket line. Some people just were anti-labor. They may be conservative, they may be Republican, whatever it was. They were anti-labor. They weren't part of that democratic historical union machine type of thing. And so those guys you're always going to have a problem with. But then you start thinking strategically, how do we win? And you're talking about legacy, and here we are, that we're fighting for something that's bigger than us. You've got to have your stars. Mm-hmm. The stars, the reason why the baseball union doesn't lose or hadn't lost for many, many years was because the superstars were like, we're not going. And if the superstar doesn't go, you don't go. What are you supposed to do if you're the backup tight end and Joe Montana's under center?
You're done.
And Roger Craig is back there.
Nobody's not going to
sit there.
They're not going to stop watching because the backup tight end is not there. If Roger Craig is still there, obviously.
And what's going to happen to you when you come back? You're getting cut. They're going to pay you back. There's going to be, this, you were a player rep. What happens to the player reps are the ones who get cut. The player reps are the ones that they go after. So you've got to really make the decision. How do we win? What are the stakes here? It's not simply a romantic exercise. You're going up against a monster. It's like the great line in Concussion where Albert Brooks says, you're going up against a company that owns a day of the week. Right? How do you win? And I think that when you start thinking about the different pieces of 87 strategically, the one of the big lost calculations was the television piece of it. That's a huge piece. And if you've noticed, obviously during some of the last labor negotiations back in 2021, what was happening in 2011, one of the big things was as the owners were preparing for the strike fund. It's not really called strike fund, but
right.
The lockout fund, as they are gearing up to mount their war chest against the players. One of the things that they have been negotiating was they get to keep their broadcast money.
Yep.
And to do that meant that we are going to outlast you. Now, if the broadcast guys were like, if you don't negotiate in good faith with the players, you're not getting the broadcast money, they come to the table. So really what's taken place here is it's an anti-labor conversation. It's not a conversation about the players not having any guts. It really is about the fact that the United States is an anti-labor country. And all of the components are stacked against you. And at some point, the reason why we talk about 87 was because 87 was the inflection point for football when they really did realize we don't have anywhere near the power that we need. We can't beat them. Now, could they beat them if they had hung in? It's the great Marvel Comics what if. What if they had hung out till November or Thanksgiving or Christmas? What if they had gone all the way? We'll never know. But at that first 3 weeks, when those star players quit, no chance.
I would love to live in that what if. And I am obviously romantic about the potential for the NFLPA. And honestly, like, to your point, it's about labor, but it's about people more than anything. In that, like, there is no power in any individual, no matter how talented you are or how successful or rich or handsome you are. Like, the power is in collective action, whether we're talking about unions or anything else. And these big, large institutions and organizations do have a measure of power. And I like to convince myself that there are some things about the current situation that make things different, but fundamentally, and when I have conversations with people about unions, like, you always have to start at, are you willing to miss work and experience the pain? And I think that's one of the challenges that I felt in 2011, and I think I read about the players feeling in 87, is that no one's ever actually been fully prepared mentally and emotionally and financially for what it actually means. I think we talk about it, and I remember leading up to 2011, everybody was tough as when we were talking about what was going to happen in the case of a lockout. And then when you actually get to the lockout, people fray. And that's, to me, about organizing on a grassroots level. It's about the centralization of power even within the organization, because once you get down to it, who are you sacrificing for? If you believe that you're sacrificing for Gene Upshaw, then you're going to fold. If you believe that you're sacrificing for someone who doesn't care about you, then you're going to fold. But that's why the bigger understanding that you are a part of a bigger mosaic about people's rights, which is hard to sell in a country when you're looking at, like, guys who are making millions of dollars. It's hard to sell that as something, because then the power of the league and control of the media then impacts it. That was one of the biggest things in our fight, was like, guys were tough until things changed and the fans were, like, annoyed. Then people get a little less tough if the fans view you as a martyr. Like, I saw this happen during the Kaepernick thing, which may seem unrelated, but it seemed different, where the experience and the understanding was like, you guys are heroes. People was ready to take a knee. Then when it was like the public opinion shifted a little bit, people started to fold some.
Well, remember, I mean, and also you're talking about your own children, because the number of players who have kids in the league now, you're also fighting for them. Yep. And so to view it that way, and it wasn't necessarily the case back in the day. There weren't that many children of NFL players who played in the league. Today it's commonplace. Yeah. And so there's that. But the other piece of it is that you have to remember that this is the most powerful piece of this entire dynamic is Ronald Reagan. That, post 1980, you're living in a place that is anti-labor. So people don't trust unions. They don't believe in unions the way they did in the 50s and 60s. It's always, the relationship between labor and management in the United States has always been fraught. Whether you talk about it from a Cold War standpoint, where they kept trying to say that unions were communist, or whether you're talking about it from today's standpoint, where it's like the union is not your friend. I remember when I was at the Oakland Tribune, when I first started my career in 1991. I'm at the Oakland Tribune, and I remember that they had a huge labor fight with management right before I got there. I'm 22 years old. And I remember one of the editors, a guy Norm Gold on the copy desk, looked at me and he said, "Unions only exist for people with no talent. All unions do is protect people who don't have ability, who want something for nothing." And I'm like, you're supposed to be on our side on this. And I was 22 and I was like, this is wrong. This sounds like pain. This sounds like somebody who's got some trauma in a business that is shrinking. And that maybe these are the only protections you have, or that you expected those protections to save you, and that they're not as business gets more and more and more powerful. And of course, the other piece of it is that the one thing that the athletes have to understand is that the public hates you. Like, you hate the media, but the public hates you, right? I mean, the public has a love-hate relationship with you. How many times did Domonique Foxworth drop an interception and somebody on their couch was like, "I could have made that play"? No, you couldn't have. They idolize you. They love you. They wear your jerseys, but they are incredibly resentful of the life that you have. And if I'm making $27,000 a year and you're making $270,000 a year, I'm taking your rights away from you. You have no reason to strike. When the Cowboys, when Danny White and Randy White and Tony Dorsett and a lot of those guys went back, the public booed them.
Booed them.
When the players came back, the public booed them. And so it's just important to remember that how many more times, and in the newspapers, if you go back and just look at the newspaper clippings, they were the writers would often mention one of the great no-nos, at least when I was coming up in the business, one of the great no-nos was you don't talk about a player's salary per play. Joe Montana, who makes $31,000 per game, right? I mean, they're really tough. Essentially, that message to the public is you have nothing to strike about. You have no grievance.
It's interesting, like creating that divide amongst, I mean, it's hard to have a conversation with you that doesn't actually go into a broader microcosm for society in general, but like creating those divides within the union and externally are things that make it super challenging. And those divides existed in the union even without them creating them in what players wanted. And this goes back to the division of labor and like the hierarchy of players is like the fight, from what I understand, became about free agency, but that wasn't what was driving the rank and file of the players. Like there were other things. Obviously, free agency was important, but it was a lot more traditional union issues about severance and workers' compensation and pensions and those sorts of things.
100%, and especially in that sport. One of the stories that came out right when the strike ended in the third week of October was really talking about, you talk about the players that came before you. It was, okay, well, what happens? What does vesting mean? And we're talking life and death here, because some of the analysis from the Players Association was like, look, some of your vesting in your pension, you're not even going to be able to use it because the average life expectancy is mid-50s. So you're going to be dead before any of this money comes in, and it's not even real money. It's not big money at all. So they didn't even, and football didn't even have a pension system for players who had played before 1959. You got nothing. And no bodies are broken more than football players. You got nothing, no compensation. The vesting options were so small. I mean, so you're not just fighting about free agency, although you are talking about player movement because free agency increases salaries. And let's also not forget that you've got the argument that the league had been selling to the public since the 1930s from all sports had been, if you allow the players to change teams, the league won't survive. And we know now that free agency made the owners richer than ever. But that argument had always been that if you do this, you're going to destroy the sport, no matter what sport. So there's that. And then the next piece of it that's extremely important to remember as well is that once you're finished as a player, the number of opportunities that were going to be open to you were virtually non-existent. So these players you are talking about watching TV every Sunday for your entertainment, but we're talking about, they are talking about as players, what happens to me as an adult when my average 3-year career is over? And the players really did not have any leverage, but they also didn't have any sympathy. So it's not just what you're reading in the media. It's also you going out with your family and buying groceries and having people say, you're getting paid all this money to play a kid's game. And now we're talking about, CTE and broken bones and broken bodies and the whole thing. And premature, the average guy eating nachos, watching TV, lives to be 76 years old, but the average offensive lineman lived to be 53.
Whether it was intelligent design or happenstance, that is one of the most difficult things about the way that the game is designed. It's designed in a way that the names and faces you do get to know are the quarterbacks and the stars.
And what did they say about the quarterbacks? He's the CEO on the field. He's the extension of management on the field. And believe me, those relationships, like I said, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You lived it. What is the first thing ownership does? They cultivate the quarterback. And so therefore, because the quarterback in a lot of ways may feel more of an affiliation or an affinity for ownership than they do with their own union, because they are that separate, because they are the glamour position.
Obviously, I've been there. I experienced it. We had the good fortune of Drew Brees, which is not good fortune for him, but Drew Brees having had his shoulder messed up in San Diego with the Chargers. He learned pretty quickly that you ain't management.
They will teach you that you're just a player.
It happens to all the players, and they eventually figure it out at a certain point, but still, it's pretty easy, or at least it felt easy, from our side looking over to understand how singular their focus was. Like the division, they're obviously division within the ownership ranks, but one thing they always agree on is lowering the amount of money that has to go to the labor. And it's not hard for them to galvanize around that. And it's pretty difficult to get players to galvanize around one vision when, to your point, their experiences are incredibly disparate.
Yeah, and also you're fighting against another enemy that is the enemy that you can never defeat, which is time. I only have 3 years to do this. I'm not getting any younger. I can't do this in my 40s. I can't do this in my 50s. I'm 23 years old. I'm going to be playing this game from 23 to 30 if I'm lucky. I don't have the luxury of going off on the picket line and losing years. Especially when you know, and I know, there's some 11th grader out there who's already got his eyes on my job. There's no job security here. So these questions, when you're really thinking about this, and this is one of the reasons why there's such great conversations, is because none of this is important to the person watching. That's the other problem they don't care. They don't care about your job because it's your job. It's my entertainment. It's your job. And so, therefore, you figure out what's taking place at how many times do you hear fans talk about today, like in the NBA, with the trying to get millions under the second apron? We have to get under the apron. It's not your money. We don't have to do anything. And so, but this is simply what you're up against, and this is what the players were up against. And I think that when you go back to 87, and of course in every sport, every sport has its moment. For the baseball players, it came 7 years later with the '94 strike. And so these were the things that you discovered that, okay, here's what you're up, and this is why Marvin Miller was so brilliant. He could sit there and tell you, here's what you're up against. Don't listen to me. Look at your situation and see what you're up against. And you would think that free agency was the one thing, like, where are the areas of penetration that the public will understand? If you don't like your job, you can change jobs and they can't.
Well, I mean, that's what's also, we didn't touch on this, but you teed it up perfectly, is The USFL, like a competing league,
and also
just
exactly.
before.
In the USFL, by the way, that's right. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's it. Is that was the idea that you could change your job, and it goes back to the point that Roger's making about not being in competition with other sports. Like competition for professional sports leagues is like what they claim to be built on, but they're the ones who don't want the competition, because competition means that they have to actually compete. They have to compete for wages. They have to compete for benefits, because, to your point, if you don't like your job, you can find another job. And if your skills are so specialized that there is only, and if they have managed to destroy all the competition, your skills so specialized, and it seems like, to your point, back to the guy from the Oakland newspaper, is like, no, unions are only for people who don't have talent. You could be the most talented person in the world. If you only have one person willing to buy your services, you have no leverage.
You have no market. That's right.
Yeah.
And that's what ended up happening. And that's why I think sometimes, on the one hand, I felt bad for Gene when Gene was like, what was Bryant Gumbel doing calling me a lapdog? Like, this is what we're up against. And, and I see it from the player's position, and I have been fortunate enough to be in 3, I think, strike situations, and none of them came to pass. However, I do remember being in press boxes when the Seattle guys were on strike, the Seattle newspapers were on strike, and they were handing around a collection, and you put money in it because this is it. If there's no Seattle newspaper, then what happens to me when my newspapers bother me? I can't go to Seattle, right? I mean, so you need that type of competition. And when that stuff gets taken away from you, it really is. Don Fear has it correct. The game is not players, the game is players versus owners. It is not Red Sox Yankees. And I think that, and people like to laugh about this. They do. They laugh at the players in '87 because that the owners got more and more and more powerful. But was it better? Was it better for the sport? And you need that balance. And I think one of the things that did come out of that as well was that the union had to decertify. They didn't come back together for 6 years, which people also don't realize. Yep. It took 6 years. And even today, to this day, you still have the right of first refusal in the NFL. Somebody wants to sign you, you get to keep them. First it was Plan B, then it was a transition tag, then it was a franchise tag. And so you still, in the NFL, to this day, you still have restricted free agency. You still can't just change teams. There's only been one guy at the quarterback position who has been able to be a completely unrestricted free agent in his prime, and it's Kirk Cousins. And look at all the money he's made. And no one talks about Kirk Cousins as one of the great quarterbacks of his time, but Kirk Cousins is the one guy who has been able to actually realize what's possible.
I certainly want to close out with us spinning it forward a little bit and wondering if the environment or the circumstances around the players and even within the players has changed to a point that in 5 years there could be some different result. I already think I know your answer. I think I'm not going to like it, so I'm going to go ahead and brace myself and get ready to rebut.
Well, I think there's a few things. First of all, the players are getting more guaranteed money than they've ever gotten before. So they do have a little bit more control than they've had before. Do they have control over discipline? Do they have control over arbitration? Do they have some of those things? They've gotten more than they had before, right? So in some ways, it's not like the whole battle is lost. It's not. The dollar amounts have gotten so much bigger now that the players, it's still a job that you do have an opportunity if you play 4, 5, 6 years to be set for life. You do have those opportunities. So it's not all disastrous. Where it is disastrous is simply in the fact that everything that this conversation is based on is about something that really doesn't exist as much anymore, and that is community. This idea that we all have a shared responsibility. This country has gotten more and more and more individual. It's gotten more and more and more cynical. It's getting more and more and more cynical and more individual. It's also, the 21st century has been the century of the billionaire. There haven't been very many labor victories, which is why it will be very interesting to see what the WNBA does. Already you're hearing the public go, what are they complaining about, right? Here, they're already massing up against them. And so these are the really hard battles. And the question is simply going to be, in baseball, you've got the opposite argument, which is the players make so much money now, and they won all those old battles by sticking together, that even when they lose, they win because they have, because the compensation is so high. I don't think I believe that, but what I do think is important from the standpoint of if you're a football player going forward, is at some point you do have to, one, you got to get your own house in order in the PA with all that, with the scandal going on. But you also need the leadership to remind people that you are not being compared to the electrician or the plumber or the janitor. You are being compared to the percentage of revenue that your industry is bringing in. And you got to just hold to that. Because if I went to that plumber and said, hey, man, we want to restrict your money, they'd be like, what do you get your hand in my pocket for? So why do you want to have, you can't listen to the public. You got to just go and be, fight for the rights that are yours.
When we get down into the real nitty gritty of what the future of union stuff would look like in professional sports, is scary because I think the leverage is obviously, it feels like it's even more disproportionate on the other side. And I would even argue that baseball, while the salaries are going up, I think the division between the players is getting larger. And I think
baseball's losing.
Yeah,
they're losing their history.
And I think they're losing their history in part because they're chasing this. The owners are pretending as if salary cap is most important to them, when I'm not sure that they care, because revenue overall, the share of revenue that's going to players is going down. And they're separating certain players by hundreds of millions of dollars contracts from the rest of the players. And it's dividing. I believe it's dividing the union while the league is still getting in better position. But the football aspect of this to me is, while it is a little concerning looking at it, I think there is some clarity that's nice to have. You don't have to beat around the bush. There is one way, and it's always been one way. Like, yeah, you decertified in one. That worked out just fine. But relying on politics or law or public pressure or shame to do the job for you ain't gonna get it done. It's crystallizing to know we got to run the ball right at the teeth of the defense. There's nothing else that you can do. And it's also understanding that it's going to be hard and there will be sacrifices. I think this conversation has been about a lot of things, but one thing that jumps out to me that stands out is that it's just about division. Like, it's about finding ways to divide the people within an organization, divide the people who are in other organizations. It's just about finding ways for people to be divide the fans from the players, and thinking that, no, those players aren't like me. Like, they aren't who I am.
Well, there are two voices that really do come, that stick out to me when we have these conversations. One is, Don Fear, which I already mentioned twice, but the other is Donald Sterling, from the former owner of the Clippers. Mm-hmm. Where, right before his demise, what is he saying on that tape? Do I run the game, or do they make the game? I make the game. And if you're a player, you're listening to, that's what they think of you.
Yep.
The players are the game. And I think we all lose sight of that. And I think that the public loses sight of that because the public doesn't have the requisite professional respect that it needs to have for these athletes, because of this idea that you're doing something that everybody can do. If you ever watch any professional athlete, you can't do what they do. They are specifically unique. One of the reasons why I do this for a living is because it is one of the few businesses in this country where labor is so unique that it is difficult, if not impossible, to replace. There's only one Kobe Bryant. You can't just go get another one. And that gives you power.
And I do believe that if the players were, and it's a big if, I think it's probably a fool's errand to believe that you can undo centuries of socialization and American culture to get to a point where the fans will be on the player's side or the media will be on the player's side. Most people are going to
I don't ever see that happening.
Yeah, I know. I'm saying it's a fool's errand to believe that that's a strategy. But I do believe that there's a point, even if the revenue is still coming to the league, the idea that we could threaten to break the habitual nature of football, because that's kind of what, in part, the history of other sports losing some of their hold on American culture. If people get to the point where they're not watching every week, if you're willing to threaten that this upward trajectory, because that is true, the football and NFL have been on a rocket ship for decades now. If you are willing to threaten that as players, I think you would be willing to scare management into capitulating on whatever it is. And then that's the point. What is it that you want? What is it that we all care about?
Well, the biggest scare that everybody got was what? It was the pandemic. People realized, oh, life does go on. That's why they needed to get those games going on so quickly. Because even I'm in the business, and I was like, it ain't that important. And so the power of sport is the illusion that you need it. And once that illusion goes away, then everybody loses their leverage. And also, let's not forget, from a power standpoint, the National Hockey League in 94-95 shut the whole sport down for the whole year. They killed the whole sport for the entire season. And so it's a very, the lesson of 87 still was sticking together.
It's the only way. Well, I feel bad ending on a note that's not fun. So I will remind you that at least we got to see Lawrence Taylor pass rush against truck drivers. That's amazing. Thank you, Howard. I appreciate you doing this. Hopefully we can do it again sometime. Thanks a lot.
No, my pleasure. Call anytime.
All right. That was really fun. Thanks a lot to Howard Bryant. Thanks to all the great producers. We out.
This is the Domonique Foxworth Show.